is a member of Solidarity in the United States, a social feminist, anti-racist, democratic revolutionary organization, and an activist in Portland, Oregon, community organizing around public transit. And her presentation is the uses of the erotic, caring, labor, heteronormativity, and capitalism.
Small topic. 15 minutes. So in order to do such that, I'm going to read very fast. So listen closely. This is a close listening. Marxist feminist theorizing of gender oppression centers on social reproduction, how the populations reproduce on a daily basis and intergenerationally. And sexual relations are, of course, part of the organization of social reproduction, but a much larger part of this process is caring labor, which is a necessary function in any human society. How caring labor is organized changes across time and across societies, but a gender division of labor has always been central to how caring labor is organized. The social construction of sexuality is obviously a crucial part of the organization of social reproduction because rules about sexual practices and sexual partners are always part of family systems, and family systems are a core institution for organizing social reproduction. Under capitalism, caring labor is organized in the first place through the nuclear family household based on a gender division of labor. Women take primary responsibility for care. It can be argued that this arrangement works to the advantage of the capitalist class in terms of increasing their profits and works to the advantage of men in increasing their leisure time, their status, their authority, and so forth. Now, it's true that for any social institution, it is worth observing how it functions to benefit some groups more than others, capitalists, men, white people, etc. But this fact in itself cannot explain how and why a social institution emerged. Instead, we need a historical account, and one where women's agency is also part of the explanation. Not only what men or capitalist employers wanted or thought was to their benefit, but what women wanted and why. And then that leads us to ask questions about what kinds of political, cultural, social, and economic resources different groups of people had available to them. This is because there is always a struggle over how identities are defined and social relationships are organized. Some social actors are better able than others to push forward their claims and to define the terms of the discourse. So one way to think about the emergence and persistence of the heteronormative family household in capitalist societies is to start from what Marx pointed to as a basic contradiction of capitalism. Although capitalists need the labor force to be reproduced, capitalist competition and the constant search for profits tends toward lowering wages and, at the extreme, threatening the reproduction of the labor force. And we could argue that in some sense we're seeing that today under the new regime of neoliberal expansion. Another way to say this point would be that the fundamental dynamic of the capitalist system, production for profit, tends to make caring labor undervalued and underfunded and tends toward privatizing it. Capitalist class relations then set limits to how far care can be socialized and taken up as a societal or collective responsibility. Capitalist class relations tend to privatize care in the family and therefore shore up the gender division of labor. And the gender division of labor, in turn, reproduces patriarchal gender relations. And now it seems to me that the social reproduction framework is a useful feminist Marxist approach to thinking through how gender relations in capitalism intersect. But the problem I run into is that this analysis essentially ignores sexuality and the system of sexual stratification, of power organized along the dimension of acceptable and despised sexual practices and identities. And since a lot of Marxist feminists have focused attention on the gender division of labor and women's unique relationship to caring labor, I ask myself, are we simply replicating the division between motherhood and sexual pleasure desire that is embedded in the organization of both sexuality and motherhood in the society at large? Certainly the notion that healthy marriages incorporate only a certain kind of sexual pleasure, monogamous, for example, or perhaps without fetishes or transvestism, S&M practices, and so forth, connects the family system to the sexual system. But as queer theory has shown, we do need to understand heteronormativity as part of a broader organization of sexual stratification in its own terms, and not only as an effect of gender. In arguing for a theory of sexual stratification in her groundbreaking article, Thinking Sex, Gail Rubin argues that the separation of sexuality from family systems, and therefore from the social organization of gender, comes about with the development of industrial capitalism. Rubin posited that if Marxism is a theory of class stratification and feminism a theory of gender stratification, then queer theory contributes to both of these as a theory of sexual stratification. While I find her argument compelling, I am also made uncomfortable by separating out gender relations from sexuality and sexual identities. And I am wondering how queer theory can be put to use in thinking about caring and caring labor. Capitalism demands the exclusion of erotic affect and sensual relations from the workplace. Our intellectual and physical capacities, our sensing and potentially sensual bodies, are at the disposal of the capitalist employer and exist as instruments to be used to earn our wages and to produce profit rather than to be used for our own enjoyment or pleasure. As Marx pointed out, this is the essence of alienation in wage labor. Does the organization of caring labor within capitalism have the same effect? We tend to assume that caring labor is different from other labor, for lots of reasons which I can't go into here. But is there something about its organization in capitalism where so much caring labor is done in private households by women who are overburdened and isolated? Is there something about the context of caring labor that limits its erotic possibilities, its bodily and sensual pleasures? Is it partly the alienation of caring labor that reproduces the opposition between desire and care? And this question raises another. If we separate explanations of gender from analysis of sexuality, are we reproducing a binary that is already there in capitalist societies? In the same way that work and play are counterposed in capitalism, not only in thought but in material reality, caring labor and sexual pleasure are in thought and in material reality seem to be opposite of each other. Sexual pleasure, for example, is self-centered. The desiring subject is interested in her own pleasure, while caring labor is understood and often experienced as selfless, that is, maternal. So perhaps we don't want to simply accept this binary, but problematize it. What would it mean, which would mean that we would not want to theorize sexuality and caring labor as embedded in separate systems of stratification that are only tangentially linked. Perhaps it would be better to rethink sexual pleasure and caring labor not as binaries, but as located on a continuum where both caring labor and sexual pleasure are expressions of what Audre Lorde has called the power of the erotic, of our erotic connections. We might want to push further along the lines that Rosemary Hennessy has suggested. She has argued that capitalism outlaws most of our needs, not only in work itself, but more generally, by demanding that we must labor for capital in order to survive, and by forcing so many of our needs and desires into commodities. Capitalist class relations, she argues, narrow what we can experience as needs to those that can be fulfilled through consumption. So this impelled me to try to think about how caring labor and sexual pleasure are related or mutually constituted. What would a feminist Marxism have to say about sexuality? Is there a way to put together an analysis of the emergence of the modern sexual system of sexual stratification with an analysis of the changing organization of gender and social reproduction under capitalism? Why, the question is then, did a new system of sexual stratification emerge at the same time as mass production and mass consumption in the U.S.? Okay. So the emergence of heteronormativity is bound up with redefinitions of gender and gender relations, the modernization of family life, which occurs, the whole process that occurs between the late 19th and early 20th century in the U.S. And in other, I'm talking about the U.S. mostly, but it's true of other Western societies. There's a general agreement among historians that the new system of sexual stratification, organized primarily around but not exclusive to the hetero-homosexual binary, emerged in part to resolve a crisis of masculinity. This crisis arose when changes in the organization of the economy were drastically reducing opportunities for middle-class men to succeed in self-employment and therefore to access property. And property ownership was the traditional basis of masculine respect in society and authority in the family. The crisis of masculinity was resolved in terms of refocusing masculinity to be in part defined as an internal characteristic rather than a practice. Who you are rather than what you do. This crisis also was generated and worked through in struggle with middle-class women who were part of the radicalizing social movements of this period. Foucault has written a compelling account of the emergence of this normalizing discourse of sexuality in relation to the broader development within the West of new regimes of social regulation. These were theorized under his overarching concept of governmentality, and I think it is an important insight. However, what I think is missing from Foucault is a gender lens through which to account for the new discourses and regulatory regimes that emerge at the turn of the 20th century and come to define the systems of gender and sexual stratification associated with Fordism. These regulatory regimes of health, sexuality, criminality, poverty, moral uplift, and so forth were shaped not only by gender struggles, but also by the class and racial anxieties of the groups who were in the forefront of struggling for and institutionalizing these new discourses. Further, the new forms of family that emerged as part of this new regulatory regime incorporated many demands of the women's rights movements, while also reinscribing male authority within the family. Feminist historians have described this development in terms of modernizing motherhood, in which gender relations move away from separate spheres and toward a modern ideal of heterosexual normalcy associated with companionate marriage. This new family and sexual system allowed women to claim sexual pleasure in marriage, although definitions of women's healthy sexual heterosexual pleasure were male-oriented and inscribed in a patriarchal sexual system that remained unchallenged until the second wave feminist movement. The efforts to institutionalize new sexual and familial relations were carried out within the context of heightened class struggle and political radicalization. The expansion of state regulation was a response to the challenge to capitalist employers and was aimed at suppressing working class radicalization and co-opting progressive social movements. But this opening of state expansion also created the context within which men and women in the middle class could press their own agendas. Here, the emerging professional managerial class found an opening to put forward new systems of regulation that relied on scientific authority in order to buttress their claims to be the main agents of social control over against the church, other traditional forms of moral authority. Creating new social problems that would have to be solved and promising to restore social order, the professional managerial class carved out a place for itself within the context of a state that was expanding in order to respond to the growing and radicalizing working class movement. In other words, I think Foucault is quite right to insist that you cannot read the regulation of sexuality or gender or the regulation of gender off of capitalist class interests. On the other hand, I think you can make a case that it was only within the context of expanding state regulation, which was both a compromise with and a co-optation of the radical challenge to capital, that new professions which relied for the authority on state regulation were able to emerge and forward their own class agenda. This agenda was itself shaped by the differential political, economic, social, and cultural resources available to men and women within the professional managerial class and in the society at large. As Villacci, among others, has shown, the rise of sexual object choice as a marker of sexual personhood appealed to middle-class gay men who sought in part to differentiate their own sexuality from the working class and racially diverse subcultures that flourished in urban environments. Similarly, the white middle-class women who staffed the social service agencies, public health programs, and elementary schools that were instruments for disciplining working-class Black and immigrant families were constructing norms of heterosexuality that redrew the line between respectable and disrespectable sexualities and behaviors, as well as proper and improper mothering practices. The critique of tenement living engaged, among other problems, the exposure of children to their parents' sexual relations. The racialized sexualities of immigrant and Black women were associated with family household that included unmarried men as boarders and cross-household networks through which women shared caregiving labor. The ability to provide a nuclear family household with separate bedrooms for children then became one of the markers of white middle-class respectability for men and women. The reorganization of middle-class motherhood as a scientifically informed and educated practice began a century-long process of removing caring labor from the realm of an embodied, naturally driven, and sensual activity. Thus, new regulatory regimes of health and normalcy applied to both motherhood and sexuality further intensified the binary opposition between caring labor and sexual pleasure. I would like to suggest that we are living through a similar moment of transition, and I would like to see us think through how to understand the ways in which caring labor and sexualities are being transformed in relation to each other. I would argue that at the turn of the 21st century, we see a similar transformation in sexual stratification, what queer theorists have defined as the rise of homonormativity, and in family relations. I think a quick way to capture these changes is to say that whereas under the Fordist political economy, family households in the professional, managerial, and working classes became more similar, under the neoliberal regime of flexible accumulation, the class divide has widened. Marriage is increasingly a privilege of the affluent, as are stable family households. In the working class, we increasingly see the rise of what Tammy Kaplan has called patriarchy without fathers. The demand for gay marriage and the movement's discourses have originated and expanded homonormativity, the social incorporation of LGBT people on the basis of respectable sexual identities and gender presentations that can be easily inscribed within the normative relationship of the heterosexual family household. And as Alan Sears has argued, the incorporation of gay people into mainstream society has gone hand in hand with the intensifying commodification that characterizes the neoliberal order. Sears makes the important point that this commodification is a consequence of the shrinking welfare state, the thinning out of traditional social solidarities in the face of intensified competition, and economic insecurity within working class families and communities. So sexual liberalization, which was something that had to be fought for, has also been channeled into the increasing commodification of sexual identities for both gay and straight, for both men and women. Discourses of freedom and choice hide the coercive power of commodification. Motherhood has undergone a similar transformation. Intensive child-centered mothering, which characterized the ideal typical form of mothering in both pre- and post-feminism, has given way to what one scholar calls extensive mothering, and the others have turned to managerial mother. Caring labor has been commodified, so it is increasingly a contractual relationship governed. Increasingly, contractual relationships govern how care is organized. Labors of love are replaced by effective labor done by a wage labor force of workers who are racialized and feminized and precarious. A workforce that is constituted by the new regime of flexible accumulation in the neoliberal order. To be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with caring labor being shared by multiple caregivers, expanded beyond the family household, or even done as paid work. The problem is the capitalist social relationships within caring labor, within which caring labor is inscribed. And I'll stop there.